So to start off the course, I wanted to talk to you guys about how you have to set up your character first before you go straight into the animating. And I know it might be kind of exciting to get right into it and jump into it, but first let's take a moment, step back, and I'll take you through kind of the steps I went through to decide how I was going to finish this character. So since this is my first time creating an animated splash screen, I talked with Dan for a while on what things I would need, it would be different than a normal concept piece, and what I can do to help him for the animation process. And the big things that you should think of when you're doing this is think of separating the different parts and how they are going to be moving. Two, you have to also know that in the After Effects stage, they can add a lot of different effects to it, like different glows and highlights. So you don't have to get too crazy with the amount of highlights and glows that you're putting on your character in the concept stage. Three, make sure you have a pretty solid light source and direction of where it's coming from, and that way it'll help direct the light when it's added later on in After Effects, and it'll also give it a nice polished look in the very end. And lastly, you want a character that feels very natural in her pose, and it's a pose that if she is being animated, it's something that she can be, holding for a while without having to move very much. So you don't want a pose that looks very unnatural, and if it was something more like jumping or in the air, well, if there's things moving around her while she's just dangling in the air, it doesn't look that natural. So I recommend trying to ground your character more and have it be in a very solid stance. So before I even started, I jotted down on a piece of paper. I first sketched her out a little bit, did some initial drawings on what I wanted her pose to be, how I wanted the scenario to be, and then from there, I literally would write down every single thing I would want to move. And I would talk back and forth with Dan, seeing if this was something that we could do, if how many different pieces should each part that I wanted to be. So like for the hair, how many different segments did he want it in? And I would literally just write down, okay, hair piece 1, hair piece 2, head, eyes blink 1, eyes blink 2. And I would keep going down that entire list. And I believe I had 17 different items. And by the end of that, what I then did is I went into the character and I drew each on its own layer. So if I open up this character folder, you can see how if I hide things, it's just that separate item. And this is where naming can be a big thing. So you want to make sure you're naming all your different layers. And you can see even as I hide the right arm, even though there's a pretty, definitive shadow under it, I still have the entire body drawn out. And that's because if I have this arm moving, what's behind it is going to be seen. So in essence, you're drawing a lot more than what you might initially expect, because I still have to draw things that aren't going to be fully seen. So you have to keep drawing every part of every accessory that you're adding. So as you're thinking about what different parts do I write down, you have to be thinking of the final picture. You have to be thinking, okay, if I want there to be wind in the scene, well then I want her hair to be moving, I want anything that's loose or hanging or dangling, I want that to be blowing in the wind as well. So as I looked at my original sketch of Red, I saw that not only did she have her hair, but then she had these 2 ribbons that come off of her weapon, and those should be blowing big time. And those almost became the highlight of the picture in the end because of how much attention they take from the animation. And that was something that was kind of unexpected, but it came out really cool. And it's not just the things that are like obvious that should be moving, it's little things that are moving as well. So things like her body and her torso should have a slight in and out motion just to represent her breathing. And then from there, she might have a slight up and down with her whole body as well. And it's little subtle animations like that that'll really make your characters come to life. So even things that you might not think are moving that much, you should just move them just ever so slightly, and that'll add that much more realism to the character. This is another reason why having an original starting concept piece to work from is really helpful, especially for me. I can just look at the concept that I originally did, and I can pull from that, and I don't have to worry about what would she be wearing at that angle, because I already know what she's going to be wearing from the full angle, from the full concept, and then I'm just going to manipulate that to whatever pose she's in. So for this one, I can kind of imagine what all of her clothing and accessories would be doing based on the original concept that I had. And the other main thing that you want to keep in mind is where your lighting is coming from. And for things like this, it's really nice to have a nice rim light added to it. and this will just intensify the overall scene, but you want to make sure that wherever you're adding the light, that it's consistent throughout the entire character. So for her, I originally started it off with this yellow and white glow, and after a while I decided to change it to blue because it was a lot of warm and neutral colors that I was using on her, and I needed something to balance it, and I felt the yellow was a little too strong. So instead I took this blue and I outlined her pretty much throughout, and I wanted to make sure that I was keeping it at the same angle. So I kind of in my head thought, okay, I'm going to have the blue somewhere off in the distance but still overhead a little bit, and I'm going to have that be represented everywhere that I draw on the character. So as I'm going through adding these different parts, I would zoom in and I would imagine where that blue light would be hitting on each part, because I can't just go in at the very end and do a blue light pass everywhere. I have to do each of them individually. So this is where it becomes a little tricky, and it's going to take probably a little longer than you initially thought because it's a lot more work than what initially looks like. So from here it just looks like a character that's standing in a regular pose. Then if you go through each, you can really see, oh no, like there's a lot of little details and naming that you have to go through and you might not think of right away. And especially when you're doing an animation, I want to make sure it all looks natural and it's in a pose that I can give to Dan and he can be able to, mess with it easily. So just some things to keep in mind as you're doing this, and you also want to keep in mind where your lighting sources are coming from, also with the rim light, and the ground plane that she's going to be standing on, because you want to make sure that it has some sort of a perspective to it, and if your environment doesn't match with the character, then it's going to look off balanced completely. And you'll see that when I do my environment time-lapse on how initially it felt very like fish-eyed and it didn't feel very natural at all. So that's when I changed it up and I try to ground her a bit more. So just more things to think about, and this is all coming out of the initial planning stages, and you want to think and do as much as you can in the initial stages, because then you'll be able to polish a even nicer concept in the very end. So the more thought and initial thinking that you can give to this character, the better, and the better your overall animation will feel. So with that, let's get started with the sketching in the next video.